Michael Hayes knelt on the cold pavement beside a stranger, his borrowed suit collecting dirt and desperation, his trembling hands offering comfort to an elderly woman whose heart was failing beneath the indifferent gaze of a city that had learned not to see. He watched his future dissolve with every passing minute, watched his phone light up with calls from Sterling Industries, watched his one chance at salvation slip away like water through his fingers, never knowing that the woman whose hand he held was Margaret Sterling, beloved mother of the very CEO who sat in her corner office waiting to interview him, never knowing that this single moment of selfless compassion would transform everything he thought he understood about sacrifice, about goodness, about the invisible threads that connect one broken heart to another in ways that money could never measure and fate could never predict. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the one-bedroom apartment on Chester Street, illuminating dust motes that danced above the sagging couch where Michael Hayes folded the threadbare blanket he used each night, his body aching from 4 hours of sleep, sandwiched between his security shift and his delivery route. He was 34 years old, but his hands looked older, calloused and worn from work that never seemed to end, from sacrifice that never seemed enough. The apartment was small enough that he could see everything from where he stood. The kitchenette with its chipped countertop, the bathroom door that didn't quite close, the bedroom where his daughter Emma slept in the only bed they owned, her small form barely making a dent in the mattress. He'd carried up 3 flights of stairs 2 years ago, when his wife left them with nothing but debt and a note saying she couldn't do this anymore. Michael moved quietly through the morning ritual he'd perfected, heating water for instant coffee in the microwave because the stove only had one working burner, and he needed that for Emma's breakfast, pulling on the same button-down shirt he wore most days, frayed at the collar but clean because he washed it by hand every other night in the bathroom sink. His reflection in the cracked mirror showed a man who was tired but not defeated, worn but not broken. He moved to the bedroom doorway and watched Emma sleep for just a moment, her blonde hair spread across the pillow, her small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 3, and he felt that familiar tightness in his chest that was equal parts love and terror at the thought of failing her. He whispered her name softly, and she stirred, her eyes opening to find him smiling down at her. And just like that, her whole face lit up with joy that pierced through every worry he carried. The morning routine unfolded like a dance they'd choreographed through repetition, Emma brushing her teeth while he made oatmeal with cinnamon, the only way she'd eat it. Him packing her lunch with careful attention, the peanut butter sandwich cut into triangles because she said they tasted better that way, the apple sliced thin, and the juice box he'd found on sale positioned just so in the paper bag with her name written in his careful block letters. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. 3 days earlier, Michael had been scrolling through job listings on his phone during his lunch break at the security desk. The same futile ritual he performed every week when he saw it. Operations manager position at Sterling Industries. Salary range $75,000 to $90,000 annually. Benefits included. Room for advancement. His heart had stuttered in his chest as he read the description, each word feeling like something from another universe. A life he'd stopped believing could ever be his. The number echoed in his mind like a prayer, like a miracle. Enough to move them out of this apartment into a real home. Enough for Emma to have her own room with actual furniture. Enough to maybe, possibly, save for her college fund. To give her the future his own parents had given him before cancer took them both. He'd read through the qualifications with growing resignation, his finger hovering over the screen, counting the ways he fell short, how his associate's degree seemed laughable next to the preferred bachelor's, how his experience managing a warehouse crew of 12 hardly compared to the scope they described, how the 2 years since that layoff had probably made his resume look desperate and stale. He'd almost closed the browser, almost returned to his sandwich and his resignation, when Emma had appeared at the security desk after school, her backpack bouncing, asking what he was looking at with such intensity. He'd shown her, expecting nothing, but she'd grabbed his phone with her small hands and started scrolling, reading aloud the parts about leadership and problem-solving and dedication telling him with absolute 7-year-old certainty that those words described him exactly. That he had to apply, that she knew he would get it. Her faith had undone something in him, some protective cynicism he'd built up. And he'd filled out the application right there while she did her homework beside him, his hands shaking slightly as he uploaded his resume and typed his cover letter, explaining why a man like him dared to reach for something like this. The response had come 36 hours later, an email with the Sterling Industries logo at the top, and he'd read it 4 times before believing it was real, before accepting that they wanted to interview him, that someone had looked at his modest credentials and seen something worth their time. The preparation had become a family project. Emma taking it as seriously as he did, helping him borrow a suit from the community center's job readiness program, a navy blue thing that was slightly too large but clean and professional. He'd practiced his answers during his night shifts, speaking softly into the empty hallways he patrolled, rehearsing explanations for the gap in his employment, for his lack of formal education, for why a single father working 2 jobs could handle the pressure of corporate management. Emma had watched YouTube videos on how to tie a necktie, her small fingers working alongside his larger ones, both of them laughing when they got it wrong, trying again, her determination matching his. For the first time since his wife had walked out leaving nothing but debt and divorce papers, Michael had felt something dangerous blooming in his chest. Hope. The morning of the interview arrived with the weight of every dream Michael had ever deferred for survival. He'd risen at 5, 2 hours before Emma needed to wake, and stood in the tiny bathroom pressing the borrowed suit with their ancient iron that sputtered steam, running it carefully over every crease and wrinkle, transforming the slightly too large jacket and trousers into something that might pass for professional in the world he was about to enter. His shoes were another matter entirely. Worn leather with soles that had been glued back twice, but he buffed them with an old t-shirt until they caught the light, until they looked like they belonged to a man who had his life together. The printed resume sat in a dollar store folder on the kitchen counter, 3 copies on paper that had cost him $2 at the library. Each page a testament to a life lived in fragments, and jobs that ended, and struggles that never did. Emma had woken before her alarm, too excited to sleep, and had appeared in the kitchen doorway with construction paper and crayons, settling at the table to make him what she called his good luck card, her tongue poking out in concentration as she drew a stick figure man in a suit with a crown on his head and the words, "Best Daddy," in her careful 7-year-old handwriting. Michael's throat had tightened watching her, this small person who believed in him with such absolute certainty, who saw him not as a man barely keeping them afloat, but as someone capable of wearing crowns. His anxiety mixed with determination like oil and water, never quite blending, his mind running through prepared answers, while his stomach churned with doubt. He'd checked the subway route 6 times, memorized the walking directions from the station to Sterling Industries Tower, and planned to arrive 30 minutes early, because he couldn't afford to be anything less than perfect. Before Emma left for school, she'd wrapped her arms around his waist and squeezed with all her strength, her face pressed against his stomach, telling him she knew he would do great, that she was proud of him no matter what happened. He'd knelt down to her level, holding her small face in his hands, promising they'd celebrate with ice cream that evening regardless of the outcome, that being brave enough to try was worth celebrating all by itself. The subway ride into the city became a journey through America's he only ever glimpsed, the neighborhoods transforming outside the window from struggling storefronts with barred windows to gleaming high-rises that scraped clouds, from people who looked like him to people in suits that cost more than his monthly rent. His own reflection in the subway window showed a tired man with hope still flickering in his eyes, a man who'd learned to expect nothing but was allowing himself, just this once, to want everything. Michael emerged from the subway station into a world that felt like a different planet, the business district stretching before him in glass and steel, and the kind of prosperity he'd only ever seen from the outside looking in. The sidewalks teemed with people in suits that probably cost more than he made in a month, their faces focused and purposeful, their expensive shoes clicking against concrete in a rhythm that spoke of places to be and power to wield. He was 45 minutes early, exactly as planned, and he pulled out his phone to confirm the exact address of Sterling Industries Tower, his finger swiping across the cracked screen to pull up the email one more time. When he heard it, a sound that cut through the urban noise like a knife. A small cry of distress that his body recognized before his mind could process. He looked up and saw her 20 feet away. An elderly woman in an elegant coat that spoke of old money and good taste, collapsed against the wall of a building, one hand clutching her chest, the other reaching out toward the stream of people flowing past her like water around a stone. Michael watched in disbelief as person after person glanced her way and kept walking, their eyes sliding away from her distress, their faces carefully blank, too busy or too afraid or too used to the city's suffering to stop. The woman's face was pale, her breathing labored even from this distance, and Michael felt time begin to stretch and slow the way it used to during his EMT shifts before the hospital layoffs, before everything fell apart. His feet had already started moving toward her before his mind caught up, before the conflict hit him like a physical blow. The interview was in 42 minutes. Sterling Industries Tower was 3 blocks away. Victoria Sterling herself was probably already in her office preparing to meet him. And this moment, this one chance to save himself and Emma from the edge of homelessness they'd been teetering on, was slipping away with every second he spent not walking in the opposite direction. But his training was already flooding back. The protocols and procedures that had once been second nature, the ability to read a body in distress, and he knew with absolute certainty that this woman was in serious trouble, that she needed help now, that the next person might not stop either. Time seemed to crystallize around him, the choice impossibly clear and impossibly cruel. His daughter's face in his mind, her trust, her good luck card in his pocket, and his promise to give her a better life. All of it balanced against the labored breathing of a stranger no one else would help. Michael rushed to the woman's side and dropped to his knees on the cold sidewalk, the borrowed suit pants immediately soaking through with the dampness of the concrete, his hands reaching for her with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this 100 times before in another life. Her breathing came in short, labored gasps, her complexion pale as paper, her elegant features twisted with pain and fear, and he could see the tremor in her hands as she clutched at her chest. He spoke in a low, steady voice, introducing himself as Michael, telling her he had medical training, asking permission to help her, and she nodded weakly, her eyes finding his with desperate gratitude. His fingers found her wrist, checking her pulse with the automatic efficiency that came back to him like muscle memory. Fast and irregular, not good. And that's when he saw the medical alert bracelet gleaming against her skin, the engraved warning about a heart condition. She tried to speak, her voice barely a whisper, telling him about her medication, her purse, knocked away when she'd fallen, and Michael's eyes swept the sidewalk until he found the expensive leather bag 3 feet away. Its contents spilled across the concrete. He retrieved it quickly, his hands sorting through the scattered items until he found the small prescription bottle, nitroglycerin, and he helped her take one under her tongue and his phone already in his other hand, dialing 911. His voice calm as he gave the dispatcher their location and described her symptoms. The operator told him the ambulance was 7 minutes away, to keep her calm and conscious. And Michael settled beside her on the sidewalk, taking her trembling hand in his, speaking to her in a steady stream of soothing words, telling her about Emma, about his daughter who was 7 years old and loved butterflies and believed her father could do anything, talking about anything and everything to keep the woman focused, to keep her with him. The minutes stretched and contracted, time becoming elastic, and then his phone alarm pierced through the moment, the sound he'd set to remind him to be at Sterling Industries in 10 minutes. To be in Victoria Sterling's office presenting himself as a man worthy of opportunity. The elderly woman's eyes met his, fearful and grateful in equal measure, her hand gripping his with surprising strength, and Michael reached into his pocket with his free hand and silenced the alarm without looking at it. His choice was already made, had been made the moment he'd heard her cry, and whatever future he'd imagined for himself and Emma would have to find another way to arrive because he could not, would not, be the person who walked away from someone who needed him. The ambulance arrived with sirens that scattered the indifferent crowd. Paramedics emerging with equipment and practiced urgency, taking over with the kind of efficient competence that Michael remembered from his own days doing this work. They assessed the woman quickly, asked Michael the right questions, nodded approval at his actions, began preparing her for transport, but when they moved to load her into the ambulance, she refused to let go of Michael's hand, her fingers tightening around his with desperate strength, her eyes pleading as she begged him not to leave her, told them she was alone and afraid, and needed him to stay. The paramedics looked at Michael, and he saw his own choice reflected in their understanding faces, and he climbed into the ambulance, still wearing the borrowed suit that was now wrinkled and stained with sidewalk grime and the ruin of everything he'd hoped for. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket during the ride. The vibrations, like accusations against his thigh, calls from Sterling Industries that he couldn't answer while holding this frightened woman's hand and murmuring reassurances over the wail of the siren. At a red light, he managed to pull out his phone and type a quick text with his thumb, apologizing for missing the interview, explaining there was a medical emergency, someone who needed help, knowing even as he sent it that it sounded exactly like the excuse a flaky candidate would make, knowing they would never believe him, knowing his one chance had evaporated like morning fog. At the hospital he stayed while they examined her, gave statements to nurses and administrators, searched through her phone at her whispered request to find her emergency contact, a daughter listed simply as Victoria, the calls going straight to voicemail, the texts he sent on the woman's behalf disappearing into silence. 3 hours passed in the fluorescent purgatory of the emergency waiting room. Michael sitting in his ruined suit, watching other people's crises unfold around him, checking his phone to see the formal email from Sterling Industries, informing him his interview slot had been filled due to his no-show. When they finally let him back to see her, the woman was stabilized in a hospital bed, color returning to her face, and she reached for his hand again with tears streaming down her cheeks, calling him an angel, calling him a gift from God, thanking him with a fervor that made him uncomfortable because he'd only done what anyone should do. He left the hospital as the afternoon sun slanted long across the city, emotionally and physically exhausted, the borrowed suit destroyed, his phone dead, his future gone, and the only thing he could think about was how he was going to explain to Emma that being good didn't always mean things worked out the way you hoped. The subway ride home felt like traveling through the wreckage of his own life. Michael, sitting in the corner seat with his ruined suit and empty hands, processing what had happened with a mind that couldn't quite reconcile the relief with the devastation. The woman had survived, would go home to her family, would live to see another day because he'd stopped, and that knowledge sat warm in his chest, even as the crushing disappointment about the interview pressed down on him like a physical weight. He'd charged his phone at the hospital and now stared at the formal email from Sterling Industries. The corporate language, so polite and final, informing him that his interview slot had been filled due to his no-show and they wished him luck in his future endeavors. His arrival at Emma's school required every ounce of strength he had left, forcing his face into a smile as she came bounding out with her backpack, her eyes bright with excitement and questions tumbling from her lips before he could even say hello. How did it go? Did they love him? Did he get the job? When would they know? Could they get the ice cream now to celebrate? Michael knelt down on the sidewalk outside the school and took her small hands in his larger ones, his voice gentle as he explained that he'd helped someone who needed him more, an elderly woman who'd been sick and alone, that he'd missed the interview but saved someone's life, that sometimes being a good person meant sacrificing what you wanted most. He'd braced himself for her disappointment, for tears or anger, or the horrible understanding that her father had let their one chance slip away. But Emma's face had transformed with something that looked like awe, like pride. And she'd thrown her arms around his neck, telling him she was glad he'd helped, that he was the best daddy in the whole world, that the job people were silly for not waiting. Their walk home through the struggling neighborhood felt different somehow. Michael, seeing it through Emma's eyes, the boarded-up shop windows and chain-link fences, and people sitting on stoops with nowhere else to go, all of it familiar and failing, but still home. That evening in their cramped apartment, Emma fell asleep early, exhausted from the emotional day, and Michael sat at the kitchen table staring at bills he couldn't pay. The eviction notice that gave them 2 months to come up with money he didn't have, the borrowed suit hanging on the bathroom door like a ghost of futures that would never arrive. When he was certain Emma was deeply asleep, he let himself cry. Quiet tears that slid down his face in the darkness, wondering if he'd made the right choice, if being good was enough when the world seemed designed to punish you for it. If his daughter would forgive him someday, when they were living in a shelter because her father chose a stranger over their survival. 4 days later, Michael sat at the security desk of an empty office building on his night shift, exhausted from the double shifts he'd been pulling to make up for the lost opportunity, his body running on coffee and desperation, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was another debt collector or robocall, but something made him pick up, and a professional woman's voice came through the line, crisp and efficient, introducing herself as Jessica Chen, executive assistant to Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries. Michael's stomach dropped, his mind immediately jumping to the conclusion that this was some formal rejection, a personal call to tell him how unprofessional his no-show had been, perhaps even to ensure he never applied to their company again. But Jessica's next words made no sense, her voice warm, as she explained that Miss Sterling wanted to meet with him personally tomorrow morning at 10. That it was important, that Miss Sterling had specifically requested him. Michael's confusion was so complete he couldn't immediately respond, his tired mind trying to process what this could possibly mean. And when he found his voice, he asked if this was about the missed interview, if they were giving him another chance. Jessica's response was cryptic, almost mysterious, telling him that Miss Sterling would explain everything when they met, that it wasn't exactly an interview but rather a meeting, that she couldn't provide more details but it was very important he come. Michael's bewilderment grew with every word, his exhaustion making it hard to think clearly, and he heard himself agreeing more from curiosity than any real hope, taking down the address and time, confirming he'd be there. After he hung up, he stared at his phone for 10 minutes straight, trying to make sense of what had just happened, running through possibilities that ranged from them wanting to formally chastise him to some bizarre corporate prank. He couldn't sleep when his shift ended, lying on his couch while Emma slept in the next room, his mind spinning through scenarios, wondering what Victoria Sterling could possibly want with a man who'd missed his interview to help a stranger, wondering if somehow they'd found out about the woman and were curious about his story, wondering if this was closure or something else entirely, something he couldn't even let himself imagine because hope had already cost him too much. Michael entered the soaring glass tower of Sterling Industries the next morning, feeling like an imposter in a world designed to exclude him, the lobby stretching upward in marble and chrome, and the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. His best clothes, a pair of khakis and a button-down shirt he'd ironed carefully, looked shabby and small against the backdrop of designer-clad executives who moved through the space with the confidence of people who belonged, their shoes alone probably worth more than everything he owned. Security checked his identification with professional courtesy. The reception desk directed him to the executive elevators with a smile that somehow made him feel both welcomed and utterly out of place. And then he was rising through the building, watching the floors tick by in illuminated numbers, his reflection in the polished elevator walls showing a man who looked exactly like what he was, someone struggling to stay afloat in a world of people who'd never known drowning. The top-floor executive suite was a revelation in luxury that felt almost aggressive. The carpet thick enough to muffle footsteps, the artwork on the walls probably worth more than he'd earn in a lifetime, everything gleaming and perfect and impossibly removed from the reality he lived in. Jessica Chen met him personally as the elevator doors opened, and her demeanor confused him immediately. Respectful and warm in a way he wasn't used to from people like her, people whose jobs involved managing the schedules of the powerful. She shook his hand like he mattered, smiled like she was genuinely pleased to see him, and he felt his nervousness ratchet higher because he couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't read the situation at all. The walk through corridors lined with photographs of corporate achievements and ribbon cuttings and handshakes with politicians felt surreal, Jessica making small talk about the weather and thanking him for coming on short notice, and Michael responded automatically while his mind spun with questions he didn't know how to ask. Jessica led him not to a conference room but to a private office with a nameplate that read Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, and she knocked once before opening the door to reveal a space that seemed to be made entirely of windows. The city spreading below in a panorama that took his breath away, and there, rising from behind an imposing desk of dark wood and clean lines, was Victoria Sterling herself. A woman in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a suit that probably cost what he paid in rent for 3 months. Her presence filling the room with the kind of power that came from years of commanding it. But it was her eyes that caught him. Something in them he couldn't read. Something that looked almost like emotion in a face that should have been all business. Victoria Sterling stood behind her desk studying him for a long moment. Her gaze so intense Michael felt like she was reading something written on his soul, and when she finally spoke, her first words were not about the job or his qualifications or any of the things he'd expected. She asked him a single question, her voice steady but carrying weight he couldn't identify. "Why did you stop?" Michael's confusion must have shown on his face, because Victoria moved around the desk, her movements controlled and deliberate, and clarified in words that made his heart start to pound. 4 days ago, you missed your interview here. I want to know why you stopped to help instead of continuing to your appointment." Michael realized this was some kind of test, that she'd somehow found out about the elderly woman. But he didn't know what answer she was looking for, what would satisfy whatever corporate curiosity had brought him here. So he simply told the truth, his voice quiet but firm, explaining that someone needed help, that he was the only one who stopped, that he couldn't walk away from that no matter what it cost him. Victoria's expression remained unreadable, her executive mask firmly in place. But she asked about his EMT background, how he'd known what to do, and Michael explained about his training and the hospital job he'd lost in the layoffs, the skills that had stayed with him even when the career couldn't. Then Victoria asked a question that seemed almost casual but landed like a stone in still water. Did he know who he'd helped that day? Michael shook his head, admitting he'd never even gotten the woman's name, that he'd just made sure she got to the hospital safely, that her daughter hadn't answered when he'd tried to call, and that he'd left when he knew she was stable. Victoria's eyes glistened suddenly, the executive mask cracking just slightly, and she took a breath that seemed to cost her something, before speaking words that rearranged everything Michael thought he understood about this moment. "That was my mother." The revelation hung in the air between them, and Michael felt the world tilt slightly on its axis, his mind trying to process the impossible coincidence, the cruel irony that the woman he'd saved was the mother of the woman who'd been waiting to interview him, that his choice had connected him to this powerful stranger in ways he couldn't have imagined. Victoria's voice broke slightly as she began to explain, the professional composure slipping to reveal raw emotion underneath. Margaret Sterling, 72 years old, her only living parent, the woman who'd raised her alone after her father died when Victoria was 12. Her mother had been visiting the city from her countryside home, had insisted on walking alone to meet Victoria for lunch, despite her daughter's concerns about her heart condition, had wanted to feel independent and capable. The heart episode had struck 3 blocks from this very building, and Margaret's phone call from the hospital had been frantic and grateful in equal measure, describing her guardian angel who'd appeared when no one else would, who'd sacrificed something important to stay with her, who'd held her hand and told her about his daughter to keep her calm. Victoria had immediately begun an investigation, pulling security footage from the street cameras, checking hospital records, tracing the phone number Michael had used to call 911. She'd discovered his interview appointment in their system. The no-show, marked with a timestamp that matched exactly when he would have been kneeling on the sidewalk with her mother, and the pieces had fallen together in a picture that made Victoria's chest tight with conflicting emotions. She spoke about her guilt that her mother had been alone in her moment of crisis, her gratitude that someone had stopped when it mattered most, her shame that it had cost Michael everything, while her own company's security staff and employees had walked past without a second glance. Michael's response was humble, almost embarrassed, insisting that anyone would have done the same, that it wasn't heroic to help someone in need, that he'd just done what felt right. Victoria's reply came sharp and fierce. her eyes blazing with something that looked like anger but felt like grief. "The footage shows 63 people walked past my mother. You were the 64th. The number hung in the air between them, stark and damning, a mathematics of human indifference that made Michael's choice stand out not as normal but as extraordinary, not as expected but as rare. And he saw in Victoria's face the weight she carried, knowing that in a city full of people, only one had stopped, and that one had paid for his goodness with the very thing he needed most. Victoria composed herself with visible effort, straightening her shoulders and smoothing her suit jacket, returning to the CEO demeanor that had carried her to the top of one of the city's most prestigious corporations. She explained that she'd reviewed Michael's application thoroughly after discovering who he was, studied his qualifications and work history. The layoffs that weren't his fault, the single parenthood he'd managed while working multiple jobs, the struggle evident in every gap and every modest achievement on his resume. Her acknowledgement came with surprising force. He was overqualified for the operations manager position he'd applied for. His experience managing teams and solving complex logistical problems under resource constraints was exactly the kind of practical knowledge her company needed. Michael's confusion must have shown because Victoria moved to her desk and pulled out a folder, opening it to reveal a job description he'd never seen. Her new offer came in clear, business-like terms. Director of Operations, a position 2 levels higher than what he'd applied for, reporting directly to her. The salary was 3 times what the original job paid, $225,000 annually, with full benefits, housing allowance, and a signing bonus to help with his transition. Michael's shock was total, his mouth opening but no words emerging, his mind unable to process numbers that seemed fictional, that represented a life he'd never even let himself imagine. His immediate assumption, when he could finally speak, was that this was charity, pity money. Victoria's way of repaying a debt she felt her family owed him for saving her mother. Victoria's correction came firm and almost sharp, her CEO voice brooking no argument. This was business, not charity. She'd watched the security footage a dozen times, seen how he'd assessed the situation with her mother, made decisions under pressure, stayed calm while managing a medical crisis, showed leadership and compassion simultaneously in a way that revealed character you couldn't teach in any business school. Those qualities were exactly what she needed in someone at that level, someone who could handle high-pressure situations, someone who put people first while still getting results. The operations manager job had just become available at a higher level because she was promoting the current director, and she needed someone she could trust absolutely, someone whose instincts she'd seen tested in the most real way possible. Victoria's final question was direct, her eyes holding his. Does he want the job? Michael's internal struggle was written across his face, pride warring with desperation in a battle that made his jaw tight and his hands clench at his sides. He asked Victoria directly, his voice steady despite the storm inside him, whether she was hiring him because he was qualified or because he'd helped her mother, because he needed to know if this was real or if he was accepting something he hadn't earned. Victoria's response was honest in a way that felt almost brutal, her eyes never leaving his as she said both, that she wouldn't compromise her company regardless of personal feelings, because too many people depended on her leadership to make decisions based on sentiment alone, but his actions had revealed his character in ways a resume never could. And character mattered more than credentials when you were looking for someone to trust with important work. She reached for a folder on her desk and handed it to him, explaining that it contained 3 operational problems her company currently faced, real issues that were costing them money and efficiency, and she was giving him 15 minutes to review them and propose solutions. Michael realized with sudden clarity that this was the real interview, that everything before had been prologue, and his hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder and began to read. The problems were complex, involving supply chain bottlenecks, employee retention in their warehouse division, and a client communication breakdown that was threatening a major contract, and Michael's mind began working despite his nervousness. Drawing on years of practical experience, of solving problems with limited resources, of understanding what workers actually needed versus what management thought they needed, his proposals emerged practical and thoughtful, considering both efficiency and human factors, suggesting solutions that addressed root causes rather than symptoms, speaking about investment in people as a strategy rather than an expense. Victoria listened with complete attention, asking probing questions that tested his reasoning, pushing him to defend his ideas, and Michael's answers demonstrated strategic thinking married to ground-level experience that her MBA executives with their theoretical knowledge couldn't match. He spoke about dignity in the workplace, about how people performed better when they were respected, about how small changes in communication could prevent large problems, and he could see Victoria's satisfaction growing with each response, her initial skepticism transforming into something that looked like respect. When he finished, Victoria stood and extended her hand across the desk, her grip firm and warm, her words simple but weighted with meaning. "You've earned this." Michael accepted her handshake, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. Trying desperately not to cry in front of this powerful woman who'd just changed his entire life, his throat tight with gratitude and relief, and the strange grief that comes when you realize how close you came to losing everything. Before Michael could leave Victoria's office, still processing the life-changing offer he'd just accepted, Victoria told him there was one more thing, her voice softening in a way that made her seem less CEO and more daughter. Her mother wanted to meet him again, properly this time, to thank him when she wasn't in the grip of a medical crisis. And Victoria was extending an invitation to dinner tomorrow evening at her home. Michael's hesitation was immediate, his mind jumping to Emma, to the fact that he had no babysitter he could afford and wouldn't leave his daughter alone even if he could. Victoria's solution came gently, almost as if she'd anticipated his concern, telling him to bring Emma, that it was Saturday, and her mother would love to meet the daughter of the man who saved her life. That Margaret had actually specifically requested it when Victoria told her about offering Michael the position. The address Victoria provided made Michael's stomach tighten with fresh anxiety. An exclusive neighborhood he'd only ever seen from bus windows, the kind of place where security guards asked questions if you looked like you didn't belong. His worry about bringing Emma into that world was immediate and visceral. The fear that she'd see how differently other people lived and feel ashamed of what they had, or worse, that she'd be made to feel less than by people who measured worth in money. That evening, when he picked Emma up from school, Michael told her about the job with careful words, watching her face transform with pure joy, her celebration so complete and unself-conscious that it brought tears to his eyes. She danced around their cramped apartment, singing about how she knew he could do it, how they were going to be okay now, and it was their first real moment of hope in longer than Michael could remember, and the first time the future felt like something other than an approaching wall. He took Emma shopping with the last money he had, finding a simple dress at the discount store that made her feel fancy, of her excitement about the dinner, both heartwarming and terrifying because he didn't know how to prepare her for entering a world so far removed from their own. Her questions tumbled out as they walked home with their purchase, asking what fancy people ate, if she'd have to use special forks, if she needed to talk differently, and Michael assured her they would just be themselves, that being polite and kind was enough anywhere, but his own nerves about entering the world of the wealthy kept him awake that night. Worried about Emma seeing the gap between their life and others, about whether he was making a mistake, exposing her to luxury that would make their apartment feel even smaller, about whether people like them could ever truly belong in spaces designed for people like Victoria Sterling. Michael and Emma arrived at Victoria's brownstone mansion on Saturday evening, both dressed in their best, walking through a neighborhood that felt like a movie set, with its tree-lined streets and elegant facades that spoke of old money and quiet power. Emma's eyes were wide with wonder, taking in every detail, the pristine sidewalks and manicured gardens and cars that gleamed like jewelry, and Michael held her hand tightly as they approached the address Victoria had given them, his own nervousness making his palms sweat despite the cool evening air. Their anxiety peaked at the door, Michael taking a deep breath before ringing the bell, Emma pressing close to his side. But then Victoria answered personally, and everything shifted. She was surprisingly casual in dark slacks and a cream sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, her smile warm and genuine as she welcomed them inside, kneeling down to Emma's level to introduce herself and complement her dress. The interior of the home was elegant but comfortable. Lived in, despite the obvious luxury, with books stacked on tables and photos on the walls, and the kind of warmth that came from being an actual home rather than a showpiece. And there, rising from the sofa in the living room, was the elderly woman from the street, Margaret Sterling, her face lighting up the moment she saw Michael with a joy that was almost incandescent. Her embrace caught him completely off guard. This woman he'd helped as a stranger, now holding him like family, her tearful thanks spilling out as she insisted he'd saved her life, that she wouldn't be here without him, that she'd been thinking about him every day. Emma's initial shyness melted almost immediately as Margaret turned her attention to the little girl with genuine interest that wasn't performative or condescending, asking about school and her favorite subjects, about what she liked to read and whether she preferred butterflies or ladybugs, questions that made Emma feel seen and important. The dinner unfolded around a real dining table that could have seated 12, but felt intimate with just the 4 of them. Victoria and Margaret, Michael and Emma, the conversation flowing naturally between stories and laughter. Margaret told tales about Victoria as a child that made Emma giggle and Victoria blush, and Emma shared stories about her father that made both women smile with understanding. Victoria found herself watching Michael throughout the meal, seeing how he navigated this new world with remarkable grace, how he kept Emma comfortable while being respectful of the differences, how he didn't try to be something he wasn't, but also didn't let his discomfort make him defensive or small. There was a dignity in him that had nothing to do with money, a groundedness that made the luxury around them feel less important than the connections being forged across the table. After dinner, while Emma and Margaret settled on the sofa to look through a photo album filled with pictures of Victoria's childhood, Victoria suggested she and Michael step out onto the terrace for some air. The city sprawled below them in lights and shadow, the evening cool but not uncomfortable, and Victoria leaned against the railing with a posture that was less CEO and more simply human. Her confession came quietly, almost as if she were surprised to be saying it aloud, that she was lonely at the top, surrounded constantly by people who wanted something from her. Investment, approval, and access, her signature on documents that would make them rich. Her vulnerability showed in the set of her shoulders, in the way she looked out at the city rather than at him. And Michael found himself responding with an observation that felt obvious, but somehow needed saying, "Money didn't solve everything. It didn't protect you from the hard parts of being human." Their conversation deepened from there. Victoria sharing that she too was a single parent, that her daughter was away at college studying architecture, that she carried guilt about not being enough, about the years spent building the company while her daughter grew up too fast. Michael understood that guilt intimately, the constant calculation of whether you were doing right by your child, whether love was enough when you couldn't give them everything they deserved. They discovered they were both driven by the same engine. Love for their daughters that made every sacrifice feel necessary and every failure feel catastrophic, and something genuine formed between them in that conversation. A connection that existed entirely outside the employer-employee dynamic, 2 people recognizing each other across the divide of their vastly different circumstances. Inside, Margaret watched them through the glass doors with a knowing smile, seeing something her daughter probably didn't recognize yet in herself. Emma fell asleep on the couch eventually, exhausted from the excitement and the late hour. Her small body curled against Margaret's side, and when Victoria and Michael came back inside, they found her completely peaceful in sleep. Victoria insisted they stay in the guest room rather than attempting the subway ride home with a sleeping child. And Michael's automatic protest weakened when he looked at Emma's face, so peaceful and comfortable in a way she rarely was. The strange intimacy of being welcomed into this family's private space, of Victoria showing him upstairs to a bedroom that was larger than his entire apartment, of her providing pajamas for Emma and leaving them with genuine warmth, made Michael feel like he'd stepped through a portal into another life entirely, one where he and his daughter were valued and cared for in ways that had nothing to do with what they could offer in return. Michael started his new position 2 weeks later, and the transformation in their lives felt almost dreamlike in its swiftness. The better apartment in a safe neighborhood with Emma's delight at having her own bedroom, walls she could decorate with posters, a window that looked out on trees instead of brick, stability for the first time in years that let him breathe without the constant weight of impending disaster. His excellence at the job surprised even him, the way his practical experience and instinct for understanding what people needed translated into results that impressed the operations team, despite their initial skepticism about his rapid rise. But the whispers started almost immediately, floating through the office in careful tones that weren't quite quiet enough. Comments about how he'd only gotten the job because of the CEO's mother, how he was Victoria's pet project, a charity case who hadn't earned his position through the proper channels. Michael overheard these comments in the break room, in the elevator, in the careful silence that fell when he entered conference rooms, and each one stung his pride like a physical blow. His decision was immediate and absolute. He would work harder than anyone, arrive earlier and leave later, prove through sheer excellence that he belonged in this position, regardless of how he'd gotten it. Meanwhile, his relationship with Victoria evolved in ways neither of them quite acknowledged. Professional respect growing into genuine friendship, conversations that extended beyond business into personal territory, lingering looks across conference tables that neither acted upon but both felt. Margaret's matchmaking attempts were obvious to everyone, but perhaps her daughter, the weekly dinners at Victoria's home becoming tradition, Margaret's pointed comments about how nice it was to have a family gathering, how well Michael and Victoria worked together, how Emma needed a mother figure, and Victoria's daughter would love a little sister. Emma and Margaret's bond had grown into something beautiful and necessary. The grandmother figure Emma had never had, filling a space neither she nor Michael had fully understood was empty, Margaret teaching Emma to bake and telling her stories, and providing the kind of unconditional love that came without the anxiety of a parent who was terrified of failing. But then the corporate complications arrived, like storm clouds. Richard Ashford, a board member with steel gray hair and old money breeding, questioned Michael's promotion publicly in a quarterly board meeting, his tone suggesting impropriety without quite making direct accusations, demanding a formal review of Michael's performance, and suggesting that personal relationships had compromised professional judgment. The room had gone silent, all eyes turning to Victoria, whose face remained carefully neutral, even as Michael felt shame burn through him, the validation of every whispered doubt he'd tried so hard to disprove. Richard Ashford's vendetta became clear through careful investigation by Victoria's assistant, the revelation that he'd been positioning his nephew for Michael's role for months before the position even opened, viewing Michael's unexpected appointment as a personal affront to his family's legacy and influence within the company. His campaign to undermine Michael was surgical and effective, spreading doubts about his qualifications in board meetings, implying to other executives that Victoria's judgment had been clouded by personal feelings and gratitude, suggesting that the company was being run on sentiment rather than merit. When a critical project landed on Michael's desk, a failing merger negotiation with a manufacturing company that could cost Sterling Industries millions if it fell through, Ashford ensured everyone knew this was Michael's test, his chance to prove he belonged or confirm every doubt that had been whispered in corridors. The pressure mounted like a physical weight. Michael working around the clock to understand the complexities of the deal, barely seeing Emma, except for rushed breakfasts where she watched him with worried eyes that reminded him too much of the dark days before Sterling Industries. His exhaustion and stress manifested in short temper and distraction, in falling asleep over spreadsheets at the kitchen table, in missing the school concert he'd promised to attend because he was on a conference call that ran late. Emma's worry about her father returning to his old patterns of overwork came out one night when she asked quietly if the new job was making him sick like the old jobs used to, if they could go back to being poor, if it meant having him back. The key moment came in a negotiation session when Michael made a bold call that went against conventional wisdom, proposing that instead of cutting costs through workforce reduction as the merger traditionally demanded, they invest in retraining programs and preserve jobs, arguing from his experience that workers who felt valued produced better results, and that the real inefficiency wasn't labor costs, but the constant turnover from treating people as disposable. For 48 hours, the outcome remained uncertain, the other company's executives deliberating while Ashford prepared his "I told you so" speech, already drafting the board memo that would call for Michael's removal. Victoria's quiet support never wavered despite the board pressure. Her faith in Michael evident in the way she defended his approach even when other executives questioned it, in the way she stood firm against Ashford's increasingly direct attacks. Margaret's wisdom came during a late-night phone call when Michael confessed his doubts. His fear that he'd been arrogant to think his instincts were enough, and her voice came steady and sure through the line. "You trusted your instinct when you stopped to help me. Trust it now." The merger succeeded spectacularly. The manufacturing company's executives calling Victoria personally to express their enthusiasm for Michael's approach, praising his understanding of workforce dynamics and his innovative solution that created a win-win scenario the previous negotiating team had completely missed. The company's profits soared in the quarter following the merger completion, the numbers exceeding even the most optimistic projections, and the board meeting where the results were presented became Michael's vindication. Even Ashford had to acknowledge the success through gritted teeth. His nephew quietly removed from consideration for any senior positions, the whispers in hallways replaced by genuine respect from colleagues who doubted him. Victoria's pride was evident in her eyes, though she maintained professional composure, her presentation of the results crediting Michael's leadership and unconventional thinking, and Michael sat in that boardroom, feeling like he'd finally earned his place through merit alone. But the victory felt hollow, tasted like ash in his mouth, because in his obsessive drive to prove himself worthy, he'd missed Emma's school play where she'd had a speaking role, had forgotten their ice cream tradition for 3 weeks running, had become the absent father he'd sworn he would never be. The kind of parent who prioritized work over the small moments that actually mattered. Emma's quiet disappointment cut deeper than any boardroom criticism ever could. The way she'd stopped asking him to read bedtime stories, the way she'd learned to expect his absence rather than his presence, the way she'd become smaller and quieter in their new apartment that was supposed to represent their better life. Margaret's gentle intervention came in the form of an invitation to her countryside home for a weekend, insisting that Michael needed to remember what actually mattered, that success meant nothing if you lost yourself in achieving it. There, in Margaret's garden on a Saturday afternoon, Michael watched Emma play among the flowers, her laughter reaching him where he sat on the porch, and he felt the weight of what he'd almost sacrificed pressing down on his chest. Victoria found him there, settling into the chair beside him with 2 glasses of lemonade, and their conversation turned honest in a way it never had before. Michael confessed that he'd been losing himself in proving his worth, that he'd almost become the thing he'd always feared, a father who loved his child but couldn't quite be present for her. Victoria's admission came quietly, that she'd done the same thing her entire life, that she'd built an empire but missed her own daughter's childhood, that success had cost her more than she'd ever meant to pay. Her vulnerability showed in the tremor of her voice when she said she was falling for him, had been for months, but feared crossing the professional line that separated them, feared that her feelings would compromise everything they'd both worked so hard to build. Michael's decision crystallized in that moment on Margaret's porch, watching his daughter rediscover joy in a garden, while he sat paralyzed by the realization that success meant nothing if he lost Emma in the process of achieving it. On Monday morning, he walked into Victoria's office and made his request for more flexible hours, for the ability to prioritize Emma's needs alongside the company's demands, prepared to resign if necessary. Because being the father Emma deserved mattered more than any title or salary. Victoria's response surprised him with its immediacy and understanding. Her confession that she was restructuring her own life too, spending more time with her mother after the terrifying reminder of how quickly everything could be lost, bringing her daughter back from college more often to rebuild the relationship she'd neglected in her climb to the top. Her confession came with trembling honesty, that she cared about him beyond the professional, saw in him everything she'd been looking for but thought didn't exist in her world, authenticity and goodness and strength that had nothing to do with resumes or pedigrees. Michael's reciprocation was immediate, but came with conditions that made Victoria's eyes shine with something like relief. His declaration that he loved her but refused to be another person who wanted her for her wealth. His stipulation that they figure out a real relationship as equals, despite the title differences or nothing at all. Victoria's acceptance came with a kiss that tasted like new beginnings and second chances. 6 months later, Michael was thriving in his role, respected on his own merits, maintaining the work-life balance that let him be present for Emma's homework and school events while still excelling professionally. Emma flourished in her new school with Margaret as a constant presence in her life, the grandmother she'd always needed, providing wisdom and unconditional love in equal measure. Michael and Victoria's relationship grew naturally, built on mutual respect and genuine love that deepened with every shared dinner and honest conversation. The final scene unfolded at Emma's 8th birthday party in a public park. Both working-class families from their old neighborhood and wealthy colleagues from Sterling Industries mingling around picnic tables, the barriers between worlds dissolving in the shared celebration of a little girl who'd brought them all together. Margaret watched her daughter and Michael with Emma, the four of them laughing over birthday cake, and her contentment was complete. One choice, one moment of compassion on a cold sidewalk, had transformed multiple lives in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars or promotions, had connected hearts across impossible divides, not because of money or reward, but because goodness recognizes goodness, because character reveals itself in the moments when no one is watching and everything is at stake. Be the person who stops, who sees others, who chooses kindness even when it costs you everything you think you need. Because that's when your true character is revealed, when the universe conspires to reward not your credentials but your humanity. When you discover that the best things in life come not from grasping but from giving, not from climbing but from kneeling beside a stranger and choosing to care.